Well, welcome along to this interview where we are going to be talking about leasehold, very much in the property headlines at the moment. And I'm joined by Mark Chick, who is Director of ALEP, and that is the Association of Leasehold Enfranchisement Practitioners. So Mark, lovely to meet you, and thank you for having us along to your lovely offices in London.
Great to be here.
Very interested to know about ALEP. What's it all about? What's its aims?
Right, okay, so ALEP is the Association of Leasehold Enfranchisement Practitioners. It's an umbrella organisation for solicitors and surveyors that work in what's called leasehold reform. It's all about extending your lease or buying your freehold. And ALEP is a signposting organisation. If you are looking to do a lease extension or you're looking to buy your freehold, if you come to an ALEP member, you know that you're going to go to somebody, you'll be signposted to someone who is a quality operation that's got experience of working in that area. One of the reasons we set ALEP up in the first place was because there were too many people who were losing out because they weren't getting the right kind of advice in relation to leasehold issues, specifically around extending their lease or buying their freehold. So that's what ALEP is and does. It's an umbrella organisation. We promote excellence. We're all about education, training for our members, and making sure that the consumer gets the right kind of advice in relation to leasehold issues.
Fantastic, and I think, you know, we do need consumer advice around leasehold. It can be quite a complex topic. Your members, do they have to voluntarily commit to professional standards, or is it more than that?
Oh, it is very much more than that. So ALEP, as a membership organisation, has got a code of practice, there's a charter, all our members are vetted. So if you come and use an ALEP member, you know they've got to have a proven track record in the industry before they can actually join our association. So you're not going to be getting someone who dabbles in this, you're getting someone who's a professional, who's properly experienced in the area. And we've got over 250 member firms, we've got all of the leading solicitors and surveyors working in this area within our what is a fairly niche organisation, but as leasehold issues become more to the fore in public awareness, we're seeing greater interest from professionals in coming along and joining and providing this advice. So, yeah.
Excellent. So from a landlord perspective, if a landlord is watching this who's looking to do a lease extension, they could go to ALEP and be directed to a suitable practitioner? Absolutely,
very much so. So one of the questions we often ask landlords when we're out there talking to them, if we go to property fairs, is to say to them, well, if you've got leasehold properties, do you know how long the lease is? Because, of course, a lease is a diminishing asset. So maybe they're going to look to enfranchise, maybe to buy the freehold together with others, or simply to take steps to extend their lease. And one thing I would say to anybody who's got multiple properties would be to be very clear about how long those leases are, because at some point in the lifetime of the asset you're going to need to take steps to address that point.
No, definitely. You mentioned reform there, and that's very, very much on the government agenda over the last few months, and I know that you've been actually very closely involved with that process. You know, government intervention, sometimes it can be good, sometimes it can be not so good. Yes, where are we at with leasehold reform?
Okay, so there's quite a lot going on in leasehold at the moment. As you may well be aware, there's been a big consultation. The government gave the Law Commission the job of reducing the price payable on enfranchisement and making it easier. So there's a government white paper a while ago fixing our broken housing market. Out of that has come a number of commitments from government to invest time and energy in reforming the leasehold sector. So the Law Commission's job has been to produce a wide-ranging paper setting out options for reform in two areas. One in relation to the law itself, and also into the reinvigoration of common hold, which is an alternative to the leasehold system. And then secondly, in relation to reducing the price payable when people do exercise these rights. Now, it's very important to stress, for the purpose of the viewers, that none of this is law at the moment. It's only a consultation. But the government is very committed to change in this area. So we're going to see a number of things that are going to happen in the short to medium distance future. Right now, January this year, we've had a report back from the Law Commission with their options for reforming the law in relation to the enfranchisement calculation. And that would have, they've set out to government 3 possible ways in which the overall price could be reduced. Now, none of those things are law yet, and we also expect a much bigger report from the Law Commission in the spring later this year, in which they will set out some options for reforming the law in relation to enfranchisement more generally. Now, when that's received, then it will be for government to decide whether it wants to take any action in relation to that. Now, sadly, history is littered with plenty of examples of excellent reports from the Law Commission which have simply sat on the shelves and gathered dust and have not found the time to be enacted by Parliament. However, when the Law Commission took on this particular piece of work, which is their 13th programme of law reform, the government gave an assurance they would commit to doing something in this area. And we also know that MHCLG, that's the Government Housing Department, have also committed to look at trying to ban ground rents for new leases and also look to change the law so that leasehold houses can no longer be created as well, because some of the iniquities of the so-called leasehold scandal have been centred around long leasehold properties sold in the northwest, particularly with escalating ground rents, and a lot of people have bought those and have suffered as a result of that. And that is what's actually driven a lot of the reform agenda we're seeing. So there is an awful lot going on in leasehold. But the thing I would stress, I suppose, is that this is not something that's going to happen immediately. We're looking at something that is 3 to 5 years down the track in terms of the major implementation, if there is to be major implementation.
No, indeed. Now, one of the things that gives leasehold a bad name is, you mentioned it briefly there, the service charges and service charges being ramped up and so on. Is there any government appetite to look at those service charges and maybe, cap them or make them more reasonable?
Well, service charges are separate from what's called ground rent. Ground rent's an automatic payment you have to pay under the lease. Now, one of the reforms I mentioned a moment ago is the idea that ground rent itself could be abolished for new leases. So it's a proposal that new leases will have a rent that's set at 0. That won't apply to existing leases, so there'll be no retrospective change to anything that's currently in place. But if you extend your lease under statute, the ground rent will be wiped out. And in the same way, if you agree a voluntary lease extension with your landlord, the landlord will only be able to impose a ground rent for the remaining term of the existing lease. So into the new lease term, there could be no future ground rent. Service charges are something entirely separate. Now, they are the cost of running the building itself. Now, of course, there's a lot of debate about service charges, and in particular in the relation to estate charges and leasehold houses. That's another area where there's a legal lacuna, because there is, in fact, no appropriate remedy at the moment. You can't take those costs to a tribunal to have them assessed, and government are looking at that. But in relation to leasehold service charges more generally, we're just simply in a situation where the tribunal, the first-tier tribunal of the property chamber, has jurisdiction to determine whether those costs are in fact reasonable or not. So there is a degree of control there. There's always unhappiness from leaseholders where a service cost is imposed on them. But speaking personally, I don't believe that system is particularly broken. I think what there is a degree of misunderstanding, and also sometimes a lack of leaseholder action. If you really don't like your management company, then you can exercise the right to manage, or you could seek to buy your freehold. Those are collective endeavours. You can't do them on your own, but it's, those options are there. So there are ways of writing the bad landlord or freeholder out of the picture, if that's what you really want to do. The one thing I would say to any investor looking to buy a leasehold property is to find out who the landlord or freeholder is, who the management company is, to know and understand what they are like, what is their reputation in the marketplace, because that makes a big difference to the long-term cost of owning the asset, and that's something you should factor in at the outset.
No, that's very good advice, and we do have the sort of the same companies being commented on about, in that regards on property tribes. So there's lots of information out there to have a look at management companies and see, what they're like to deal with. I think the other thing, obviously, is the issue of cladding. We've had lots of landlords come onto property tribes in recent months saying that they're really struggling to sell or remortgage a leasehold property that's got cladding on it. Is there any kind of hope in sight for them? I know the government's put out some protocols to address this issue, but it seems to have kind of got stuck by what our landlords are saying.
I think it's a very difficult issue. It's very, very difficult to comment on that at the moment, precisely for that reasons you've just mentioned. I mean, ultimately, you could say this is in part due to a failure in the building regulations. Ultimately, how have these materials got onto buildings in the first place? So there's a very difficult political question that underpins all of this. That's not really going to help people with the short-term misery of the problem. And a number of freeholders, some of the bigger investor landlords, have in fact in a few cases taken remedial action and actually contributed towards the cost. But in general, in a properly drafted lease, unfortunately, if you have one of these cladding, ACM cladding things on the outside of your building, it's very likely that you and the other leaseholders will end up paying for the cost of this to be remediated at the moment. The government has set aside a compensation fund, which is towards a fighting fund for people wanting to take action in relation to this. But we are very much in a development phase here, where a lot of people are, there's been a lot of reactive activity by landlords. People have got waking watches and and fire guards in their house, in the buildings and the common parts, all of which add to the cost of maintenance and repair for the property in the short term, and doesn't say anything about the long-term capital issue of what's going to happen when the cladding needs to be replaced. So I think this is something government is going to have to look at, but because it's such a big and difficult political question, I think the government is moving quite slowly on this. So I'm afraid to say it is a known ongoing issue. And I think the big thing to say to people who don't have a property with this type of problem, if you're looking at any property with any kind of cladding, you need appropriate investigation into that now, because you're going to face the problem that you've just mentioned that some of your viewers have had, which is remortgaging and selling. The other thing is that the position's quite well understood in relation to buildings with cladding that are over 18 metres in height, but there are also a number of buildings that are not that high that also have this cladding on, and there's not any real immediate record of where those are. So it's very much a question of checking it out locally. And if you're in the unfortunate situation of having that problem at the moment, well, I guess if you're a landlord, you're still getting the income stream from the property, but you're going to be concerned about the long-term capital depreciation or the long-term cost of fixing the problem.
Mark, I'll just move on a little bit now because it's quite well known on Property Tribes that I'm not a massive fan of leasehold.
Okay.
From a landlord perspective, I do like my freehold houses for many reasons, and I'll put a link underneath the thread to explain why. But just to finish, I just wondered, let's flip this over. What are the positives to leasehold?
Okay, well, perhaps as a leasehold lawyer, you might expect me to say that I like leasehold. I don't think I'm completely wedded to it. I think it's got pros and cons. But if you wanted me to say why is it a good system, it's very flexible. Now, one of the advantages of the leasehold system is that you can use it in a very creative way. So if you've got a mixed-use development, so you might have a shopping centre with flats above, you can let various different parts of the building out at different heights. You just create the lease over the relevant areas, all the leases will mesh together, the service charge regime will work, you can add a bit to the property, you can take a bit off, providing you can draft for that. It's very flexible, it works very, very well. The other thing is that there's a good level of control. Now, that's exactly why you might not like leasehold, because there is, of course, the bogeyman, the landlord, the person that's in control. But having said that, there's a sense in which strong governance may help, because if there's somebody who's not behaving who's a leaseholder and someone else is able to take action against that person on your behalf, then that does put everyone under the same, perhaps, draconian spell. But it's a good thing from a control point of view. So people will say it's feudal. It's not strictly feudal because it doesn't come from the Middle Ages. Leasehold's a little bit younger than that. But nonetheless, it has got its disadvantages. But one of the reasons that we still see it in use today is because of its flexibility.
No, that's very true. And also leasehold flats, you can only get flats that are leasehold. And,
Absolutely.
Playing devil's advocate, there's a huge demand for leasehold flats. And, they're the kind of entry level into property investment as well. So some landlords may not have the choice to buy a house. So there are good things to say about flats as well, particularly as well, because you've always got an exit to a first-time buyer.
Well, one thing I could say as well, if you're looking to buy a flat and you're not sure what would be the optimal scenario for one of your viewers as an investor, well, if it's got a 999-year lease and a share in the freehold company, then that's like a virtual freehold, and that's as good as, arguably some people would say better than, the proposed common hold system, because that's almost a completely invulnerable system. So if they've gone through the final step of buying their freehold and they've taken their leases up to 999 years, cancelled out all ground rent, then you've got a very flexible leasehold system where the leases can be varied, if need be, by agreement across the board. And you've got total security because you own an interest in the entity that owns the outside of your building. So that's a working structure. There we are. The other thing we could come on to briefly is the idea of common hold, which of course is the replacement for leasehold, currently on the statute books, been on the statute books since 2003, but not currently working. Now, that's another thing that the Law Commission's consultation is going to look at, about how that can be reinvigorated, making it more fit for purpose. And I think if government get bold with this, then what they might do is incentivise the use of common hold for new developments. And that will be a totally new species of land tenure, quite exciting, similar to the systems that we have in Australia and New Zealand and elsewhere in Commonwealth jurisdictions, where you simply own an interest in a company which owns the exterior of the building, and you also then own a freehold unit within the building itself. So that ultimately is the future, but when we will get to that future, I can't quite tell you now.
Well, it's been awesome speaking to you, Mark, and Mark's very kindly agreed to stay with us for a second interview where we're going to dig a little bit deeper into leasehold reform and the landlord perspective on leasehold. But for now, Mark, thank you very much for joining me. And if you're watching on YouTube, we do invite you to pop across to propertytribes.com. That is where our discussions are hosted, and this video is in the Leasehold tribe, which curates all our leasehold discussions, and that tribe is powered by ALEP. And I've got to say thank you, Mark, for supporting landlord education in this manner of supporting Property Tribes.
Thank you for coming to talk to me.
I'll speak to you again.